About 5 years ago, a doctor gave a speech that was posted on YouTube. It wasn't long, it only lasted about 18 minutes, but it was revolutionary to the diabetic world, and it opened a lot of eyes. In this episode of Beat Diabetes, I'll share a few of the things that were said and why I think it turned out to be such a game changer for so many people. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description. Well, I won't keep you in suspense. I'm referring to a talk given by Dr. Sarah Hallberg, which was posted on YouTube as part of the TED Talk series about 5 years ago. It has become one of the most powerful and effective talks ever given about diabetes in the history of, well, diabetes. It currently has nearly 6 million views, and the number of diabetics who've been helped through this talk is uncountable. I watched it quite a few years ago. Sarah didn't convert me because I was already convinced that the main point of her message was absolutely true, so I didn't really need converting, but I was impressed. In her short 18 minutes, she said about all that needed to be said, and anyone who could listen to that talk and refuse to admit that she made a lot of sense, well, I'd have to say that they have very little sense of their own. Well, let's talk first about who Sarah Hallberg is. She states at the beginning of her talk that she is an obesity doctor, helping obese patients to lose weight and regain their health. Now, these days, about 5 years later, she appears to give more attention to reversing diabetes than dealing with overweight patients. Her website refers to her as the medical director at Virta Health, the first clinically proven treatment to safely and sustainably reverse type 2 diabetes without medications or surgery. Sarah Hallberg has become a big deal among the keto crowd and in the diabetic world. She's frequently interviewed by low-carb doctors and enthusiasts and has seen amazing success at her health clinic. In this video, I want to review a few of her statements made in the video that really launched her to become a ketogenic celebrity, and of course, throw in a few comments of my own. Let's get started. In the beginning part of her 18-minute lecture, Sarah describes something most of you would know, which is that insulin's job is to escort blood sugar into the cells of our bodies, and that insulin levels are going to rise in order to keep up with elevated blood sugar. Now, that's not a major news flash. The very first statement she makes, which is somewhat startling, is when she announces, "If you think you don't have insulin resistance, you might want to think again. Half of Americans have either diabetes or prediabetes." Now, I've heard that statement before. I'm not sure what this is based on, but I would guess it's probably true or close to true. In America and in most countries in our world, metabolic syndrome is running rampant, and it is totally out of control. Of course, diabetes is not contagious, but the lifestyle that fosters diabetes very much is contagious. It runs from one person to another, from family to family, and from one culture to another. Diabetes and prediabetes are nearly omnipresent in our world today. Sarah goes on to share the main source of high blood sugar in terms of the food that we eat, saying carbs raise glucose and insulin a lot. Proteins raise it some, fats raise it almost not at all. When we eat carbohydrates, our insulin and glucose levels are going to spike up fast. With proteins, it looks a lot better. But take a look at what happens when we eat fat. Essentially nothing. Again, this is Diabetes 101. Carbs raise blood sugar a lot. If you don't believe that, get a glucose meter, eat a big bowl of macaroni and cheese and a baked potato, test your glucose before eating, and then test your glucose about an hour after eating, and you will be convinced for sure. Now, for your next meal, eat some salmon drenched in butter and a spinach salad. Test before eating and an hour after eating. Again, your blood sugar meter will not lie. So nothing revolutionary here, at least not for most of us, but some people are so metabolically ignorant that this simple truth, easily proven, is revolutionary. It's amazing how the light comes on when people start testing their blood sugar, especially with post-meal tests. Strangely, many of the doctors, dietitians, and nutritionists either don't seem to know this, or more likely they just don't feel it's especially relevant. But for the diabetic, this is incredibly relevant. In fact, there's hardly anything more relevant. Later, Sarah describes how that when you eat a high-carb meal, such as at a Chinese restaurant, you can stuff yourself, and a short time later, you're hungry once again. She describes the standard American diet this way. We have this setup, she says. 1, eat carbs. 2, glucose goes up. 3, insulin goes up. 4, you have hunger and fat storage. In other words, the more carbs you eat, the more insulin is released, the more fat is stored in your body, and the hungrier you get. And so you eat more, have more insulin released, store more fat, and get hungrier still. And coming from the perspective of a doctor who is seeing obese patients constantly, Sarah knows whereof she speaks. During her talk, Sarah takes on the ADA. In her first comment, she doesn't mention them by name, but we all know whom she's referring to, as she says, let's focus just on type 2 diabetes. Because the general recommendations are to tell type 2 diabetics to consume 40 to 65 grams of carbohydrates per meal, plus more at snacks. Trust me on this, that's a lot of carbs. We are essentially recommending that they eat what's causing their problem. Sound crazy? It really, really is. Some people might argue that carbs are not causing the problem. Insulin resistance is. But carbs are what drive high glucose and high insulin, and a state of constant insulinemia, which leads to insulin resistance. Slash the carbs, you slash the glucose, the high insulin levels go down, and you no longer live in continual insulinemia. So while the problem technically is insulin resistance, once carbs are reduced in a major way, especially when time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting are added, you suck the life out of your insulin resistance. Sarah says this about treating diabetes by demanding meals of 40 to 65 grams of carbs. She says, sound crazy? It really, really is. Well, I agree, Sarah. This is the essence of true irrationality. It is irrational, unreasonable, illogical, ridiculous, foolish, absurd, and to use Sarah's word, just plain crazy. Sarah starts getting personal in naming the ADA, and she says that their guidelines declare that the evidence is inconclusive in allowing them to recommend a specific carbohydrate limit. Yet, she says those guidelines go right on to say what we all know. Carbohydrate intake is the single biggest factor in blood sugar levels and therefore the need for medication. In other words, they admit that the more carbs you eat, the higher your glucose levels and the more medicine you will need to take. Sarah states these guidelines go on to say, hey, look, if you're taking certain diabetes medications, you'll have to eat carbs, otherwise your blood sugar can go too low. So, according to Sarah, you have a vicious cycle that looks like this. Eat carbs, so you have to take medicine. Then you have to eat more carbs so you avoid the side effects of those medications. And around we go. Anybody who knows much about diabetes and how so many of the so-called experts have traditionally treated diabetes can hardly argue with what she's saying. It is so sensible, so powerful, and so plain that most children could see it. Sarah tells how at her clinic they encourage their patients to drop their carb intake significantly and says that their need for insulin drops in a hurry. And then she makes the one statement that I have never forgotten. I believe this one statement is the most powerful thing she says throughout the entire talk. And I'm going to let her say it in her own words.
Low-carb intervention works so fast that we can literally pull people off of hundreds of units of insulin in days to weeks. Low-carb intervention works so fast that we can literally pull people off of hundreds of units of insulin in days to weeks.
And to me, that is at the heart of what it takes to beat diabetes. Now, I'm going to admit something. I love things that work, and I hate things that don't work. If I've tried something several times and it has never worked for me, I'm ready to look for a new solution and toss that old way into the trash. Give me something that works. And cutting carbs works for diabetics. Sarah did a study with 50 of her type 2 diabetic patients put on low-carb, high-fat diets, and then she compared it with 50 diabetics treated with a standard ADA-recommended diet. After 6 months, not only did they find a significant metabolic advantage for the low-carb group, but a huge cost savings. How did they save money? Sarah says, our analysis showed that our patients could save over $2,000 a year just on the diabetes meds they were no longer taking. The low-carb group were able to decrease their insulin dosage by almost 500 units a day, but the ADA-treated group had an increase in their insulin by almost 350 units a day. Sarah states that this experiment represents two different approaches to this disease. Our group, she says, had the goal of reversing this disease, meaning they need less medication. The second group followed the assumption that diabetes is a progressive disease requiring more and more medicine over time. It's progressive, Sarah says, unless we take away the cause. I love that. Diabetes is progressive unless we take away the cause. And in my thinking, the cause is the lifestyle most of our world has adopted of stuffing ourselves with sweet pastries and candies and chips and bread products and other carbs. We've eaten so many carbs for so much of our lives that our bodies have broken down and now can barely tolerate any carbs at all, even some of the carbs most people would consider healthy carbs like potatoes, rice, and whole wheat bread. We've crossed over some invisible line, and apart from slashing our carbs and limiting our window of eating, we will never be able to get back. But the good news is if we do severely limit our carbs and practice time-restricted eating, we can get back, and often we can get back far sooner than we imagine. Sarah asks a good question. She says, why isn't this the norm? In other words, if this low-carb approach works so amazingly well, why isn't it taught in every medical school, emphasized by every dietitian and nutritionist, and proclaimed all over the world? Well, it is beginning to catch on, and we're certainly hearing more about it than ever before, but at this point, it is not considered the norm for diabetes treatment. What is the norm? Telling people to take their meds, change from white bread to whole wheat bread, change from white rice to brown rice, change from white potatoes to sweet potatoes, and go a little easy on the sugar. But this approach does not work, has never worked, and will never work. And this is why most of our experts will say with somber voices that diabetes is a chronic and progressive disease. Well, yeah, it is if you treat it with lots of carbohydrates. But it sure doesn't have to be if you'll open your eyes and try something that actually works. Sarah gives two reasons for why most establishment medical professionals stay with the eat carbs and take your meds approach. She says it's because, one, status quo. It's hard to break. People will tell you to eat your 50 or 60 grams of carbs per meal because that's what they were taught, and their teachers said that because that's what they were taught. Sarah continues, the second reason we don't see it everywhere is money. Don't be fooled. There's a lot of money to be made by keeping you sick. Now, I hate to think that's true. I always try to believe that most people have good motives, even though they may be dead wrong in what they're telling you. But I'm not so naive as to suppose that money plays no role in this at all. To close, let me take a few minutes to address the question, why did this video go viral? It's just one video about diabetes and blood sugar among thousands and thousands of videos on YouTube and all over the internet. Why this one? Well, I think part of the reason has to do with the time in which she made the talk. Even though this was made 5 years ago, which is not all that long ago, still we've learned a lot and come a long way since then. Many voices have risen up promoting a low-carb and keto lifestyle. I saw her video shortly after it first came out and I was impressed. When I watched it again to prepare for this video, I was kind of surprised to see there really wasn't anything especially different about what she was saying compared to what so many are saying these days. But 5 years ago, what she was saying was still considered pretty revolutionary. Secondly, Sarah was not afraid to take on the ADA. She didn't just hint that there was some organization out there somewhere that was giving some less than helpful advice to diabetics. She came right out and named the ADA and told exactly what they were saying and why it was dead wrong. And she backed up what she was saying with test results, including a test she did herself with 50 of her own patients, comparing them to 50 other patients adhering to ADA guidelines. And her patients mopped the floor with the ADA patients. Also, Sarah manages to pack a lot of good and powerful information into her 18-minute talk. She obviously thought aloud about what she would say beforehand, and she makes one powerful point after another with such effectiveness that anybody who held a contrary opinion but had an open mind would have no choice but to hold up the white flag of surrender. Again, her name is Sarah Hallberg. I'll leave a link in the description to that original YouTube lecture she did, and I'll also leave a link to her website, which is vertahealth.com, in the description. She has a YouTube channel by the name of Verta Health, plus you can see her giving lectures and interviews on many different YouTube platforms and videos. She's a lady worth getting to know. Okay, I think I've said enough for now. If this video has been helpful, give it a like so YouTube will promote it to other diabetics looking for answers. And consider subscribing to this channel and then click on that bell icon so you'll be notified every time we post a new video. God bless. See you again soon.